Welcome to the Open Forum in the Villages, Florida. In this show, we talk to leaders of clubs and interesting folks who live here in the Villages to get perspectives of what is happening here in the Villages, Florida. We are a listener-supported podcast. There will be shout-outs for supporters in episodes.
This is Mike Roth. And listeners, I'm thrilled to share with you this podcast, which is my passion project for you. This podcast brings you knowledge, inspiration, and a lot of things that people need to know about the villages and the people living here. Be sure to hit the follow button to get the newest episode each week. Creating this podcast is a labor of love, even though it demands more time I can easily spare. Now, here's where you come in. You can help us keep the podcast alive and thriving. How? By becoming a supporter. The easy way for you to support us is to visit our podcast webpage, openforuminthevillagesflorida.com, and click on the supporter button at the top of the page, or the purple supporter box. Even a small donation of $3 to $10 a month makes a big difference, and you can cancel your subscription at any time. Your support means the world to us. Stay curious, stay inspired, and keep those headphones on. I hope everyone enjoys today's show. This is Mike Roth on Open Forum in the Villages, Florida. I'm here today with author Michael Summers. Thanks for joining me, Michael.
My pleasure. Thank you, Mike.
Michael Summers is a retired technology professional, a lifelong learner, a cancer survivor, and he has a passion for curiosity and storytelling to inspire others. Michael, since I grew up in the technology industries, I'm curious, what part of the technology industry were you in?
It spanned an awful lot of years and did a lot of different places. My first real technology job was back when the insurance companies, which I worked for up in Hartford, Connecticut, were going from systems that were paper systems to computer systems.
Yes, the old 360 world.
Exactly. And at that time, it was distributed AS400s. But that's where I cut my teeth. And it was essentially an inside management consulting group that I was part of. And I was trained by the very best people. And so I learned how to understand systems, particularly how to take what were manual workflows and turn them into requirements for computer systems. I went from there to a computer startup in Chicago, and it was a real trip. It was a small company that was estimating the cost to repair and replace different BERT components in houses, and it was sold to insurance companies in order to help them get an accurate value for repairing and replacing homes on homeowner insurance policies. I did that for a while. And then I went into a little bit of management consulting on my own for leverage buyouts. And there I was utilizing a lot of skills I had acquired when I had my MBA. And I was essentially evaluating new companies that were trying to raise money or be purchased by venture capitalists or others. I did that for several years. If anybody is familiar with that time frame in the 80s, the valuations of those companies got crazy. I was very uncomfortable with the amounts, the values I was being pushed to generate. And eventually I just gave it up. I quit. I moved on to Silicon Valley. And at Silicon Valley, I got there at a bad time. It was in the early 90s. There was no technology jobs around. I found some work, luckily, with a land investment company where we took big pieces of land around the San Francisco Bay Area, took them through the political process, and then prepared them to sell to home builders, large home builders. That market eventually dried up, and then I was able to pick up and then get back into technology, where I, once again, very lucky, got a job as a CEO with a little computer startup. that was very unique. It was offering firmware solutions to do what they called back then multi-booting of operating systems. For example, Mac operating systems, IBM, Microsoft systems. At that time, they were all tied more or less inextricably to the hardware platforms.
Correct.
And it was an interesting time. IBM was fighting Motorola, and IBM were fighting Apple, and we were in the middle. And the reason we were in the middle is because we had the inventor of open firmware on our side.
What was the name of the company?
It was called FirmWorks. So I did that for a couple of years. We were very successful, and was essentially the guy who had to raise money and who ran the business side of things, going around and talking IBM, Motorola, and others into giving us money to keep us going, and then we provided their software and firmware to them. So I licensed that all around the world, Japan, Taiwan, United States. And then that market went down, and I had an invitation to join SRI International, which is formerly known as Stanford Research Institute.
Sure.
And I took on a job as the vice president of commercialization of technologies for the computer science department.
That's great. Now, you had a great background, both professionally and personally. How did that background shape your cancer journey and your storytelling in your book?
I think it's a good question. Writing this book, I've been thinking over exactly how I've ended up here. And it seems to me that it was some combination of problem solving, of being thrown into new areas that I knew nothing about, but having to quickly understand them, make some sense of them. Sort of getting a layman's approach on very technical subjects.
And is that how you approached your journey with cancer?
I would like to say yes right away. I jumped right into it, but no. My cancer journey began very abruptly with a hospitalization for something else. And when I ended up in the hospital, I was in great pain, and I was having so much trouble dealing with the pain that my first opportunity of using my background was to try to pull myself back and understand how to deal with the pain.
Mm-hmm.
And I tried. My father was a very stoic fellow, very technical,
Mm-hmm.
a research scientist. And his approach was the first one I tried, which was to just grin and bear it.
Mm-hmm.
That was insufficient.
I could understand that for a lot of people.
Eventually, and then I tried the concept of I'm in better shape than a lot of people around me. The problem was that people were in worse shape or the same shape as me.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't get any solace from that.
By the way, what type of cancer were you diagnosed with?
I was diagnosed with a type of blood cancer known as CML, or chronic myeloma leukemia.
Mm-hmm.
Finally, getting back to the pain thing, finally I was able to make use of something I had heard somewhere along the line. I don't know from where exactly I remembered it, but it was you ride the wave, an approach. So the interesting thing, at least in my experience about pain, was it did come in waves. What I had to do was concentrate on the down part of the wave when I was not in the severe pain.
Mm-hmm.
And I would step back and look at that, and I figured out that about 70% of the time I really wasn't in excruciating pain.
Mm-hmm.
30% I was. And that's how I wrote it. I got used to preparing myself for those waves.
We did a whole show on CLL blood cancer, and that was a very interesting show. Your cancer was a form of leukemia?
That's right. It's caused by what I found out later, and this goes back to my technical background, in trying to deconstruct what was going on with me, about a very strange flip of chromosomes. It's called the Philadelphia chromosome. And there are two little chromosomes on the helix that flip for no reason that anybody particularly knows. And that's what happened to me at the age of 70, 71, somewhere in there.
So how did they cure it?
They don't really cure it. what they do is they give you chemotherapy, in my case, in the form of a pill. So it sounds worse than it is. And what that does is it begins to work on those chromosomes and it begins switching them. And those are made by the blood and the interaction of the blood going through your bones, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
The way they measure how well you're doing is they do these chromosomal assays. And you don't just flip and then everything goes good. You have to see what percentage of those chromosomes are changing, and that indicates how well you're doing. And I've been tracking that for 2 years now. And there's a threshold below which they say you're in remission.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, I'm not there yet, but I'm going in the right direction.
Oh, that's good. That's
Yes.
good. My brother had a blood cancer, and he was finally, in quotation marks, cured with a bone marrow transplant from his own son.
Oh, that's terrific.
Yeah, I wasn't qualified. I took the test, but they said, nope, not a good match. So my brother went to his son. Now, you decided to collaborate with another cancer patient named Jim for your book. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Jim and why you decided to pick him to collaborate on a book?
Sure. I met Jim in a writing group that I'm part of in the Villages. And that writing group is headed up by Mark Newhouse. And Jim is a part of that group. And Jim is an excellent writer.
Mm-hmm.
He comes from a completely different background than me. He was a teacher of English and wrote several books that are still in publication and used in schools, primarily in high schools. And he's an older guy than me. He's about 10 years older than me. But whereas when I was a kid, not to jump back too far, but I had polio as a kid. I was 5 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time that I had polio, the cure, if you will, was that you had to wear orthopedic shoes, which immediately set you apart from everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
You weren't allowed to exercise, which is completely ridiculous now. And you're just set aside.
Mm-hmm.
Jim, on the other hand, was a star athlete. He was a great softball player. Later in his life, he went on to be a coach, a manager. And to this day, here in the Villages, he's an excellent batter. And for being 84, and he's probably in better physical shape than I am.
Mm-hmm.
So we came from different worlds.
There's a great deal of proof, at least anecdotal proof, that people who have retained more muscle mass live longer. So when you put your book together with Jim, how did you balance the challenges of cancer with offering of hope to your readers?
We have come about our path in different ways with different types of support and obviously different viewpoints. For me, found solace in reverting back to my understanding of systems, in effect, or in essence, how my body works.
Mm-hmm.
And that gave me some amount of peace because it was overcoming fear by trying to understand the system.
Mm-hmm.
Jim, on the other hand, did not have as rough of a journey as I did through cancer. But the impact for him was more on side effects of the medicines,
Yes.
as well as, I think, the cycle. And I'm speaking for him now. Maybe I shouldn't, but he, I think, in a position where he was used to being the Superman, and he had to deal with the psychological effect of not being Superman, but rather a cancer victim.
Mm-hmm. Did either one of you rely on marijuana for the side effects of the medications?
At first I did. I frankly don't know if Jim did or not. We've actually never talked about it. I did a little bit at the beginning, and after I got out of the hospital, it didn't really help that much, nor did regular pain medication.
Really? Which hospital were you in?
I began, when I first ended up in the hospital, it was through the Emergicare Center here. And they sent me right away up to West Orange Hospital in Ocala. What had happened was I didn't even know I had cancer at that point. I knew nothing. But I had this huge hematoma that ran from the back of my neck all the way down to my butt.
Really?
Yeah, it was horrible. And I was in great pain. And the first week I spent in the hospital there, they had to evacuate blood that had built up around my chest wall. And then and that's when they found out I had the cancer. And then the second week, they transferred me to the main hospital in Ocala, where they began to run the tests to understand what kind of cancer I had.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask you a question? Why didn't you go to someplace like Moffitt or Shands?
That's a good question. I think it was primarily because it just came out of the blue. It was about 2 years ago, almost today. And bang, I was at the emergent care center. I was freaking out. They were freaking out. My wife, Mary Jo, was probably the calmest person there. And it was, let's get him. We got to get him to the hospital right away. Who can take you the fastest, the soonest?
And what kind of emotional lessons did you learn from your experience, both practical and personal, that you put into the book that you think is going to resonate with readers?
I think that the most important thing for me was relating the journey. I don't react well to people telling me what to do, or particularly how to do it. I like to understand how to do it.
Mm-hmm. How many years did you spend as a CEO? Many years. So you learned to do it yourself.
To listen.
Yes.
To rely upon experts. Mm-hmm. And so I gravitated toward finding the best people I could. But I think that it was more, in my mind, about the journey and relating to readers what the journey was like for me. And Jim does the same thing from a totally different perspective, or two bookends and cancers in the middle.
Okay, so he wrote his part of the book and you wrote your part of the book. Is that how it worked?
Pretty much, yes. We completely separate. We didn't cooperate on first drafts. And we're in touch-up phase right now and stitching the chapters together so that they flow evenly.
Let's take a break and talk to Dr. Craig Curtis about Alzheimer's. This is Mike Roth and Dr. Craig Curtis. We're talking about Alzheimer's disease. What is the diagnostic process to split the difference between someone who has Alzheimer's and someone who has a different form of dementia?
That's a great question, Mike. So Alzheimer's disease in the past was a clinical diagnosis. Mm-hmm. And we would talk to the patient and the family, and they would tell us about this progressive memory loss and maybe other symptoms that had been occurring over the past 3 to 5 years. Mm-hmm. And we would simply test their memory and maybe wait another year or two and retest their memory to look for decline. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, it's completely different. As a matter of fact, now our diagnostic process involves actually looking for amyloid in the brain, which we now know causes Alzheimer's disease.
How do you see amyloid in the brain?
We can see amyloid in the brain using PET scans, which is the most common way. And now we're working on using blood tests, which are going to be coming out in the next few years. In fact, there's already one blood test that is FDA cleared to detect amyloid in the blood, which is reflecting amyloid in the brain.
And that would be the differential between another type of dementia and Alzheimer's.
Yes, sir.
With over 20 years of experience studying brain health, Dr. Curtis's goal is to educate the Villages community on how to live a longer, healthier life. To learn more, visit his website, craigcurtismd.com, or call 352-500-5252 to attend a free seminar.
I'm back with Michael Summers. Looking back at what you know now, what was the most rewarding part of the journey?
I think it was coming to know myself better and understanding where my strengths and weaknesses were, and also coming to the realization that formed a roadmap for the kind of support I needed. Understand what kind of support do I need. My wife was there, obviously, all through it. Mary Jo was wonderful. And beyond that, the doctors in particular, choosing my oncology doctor after I got out of the hospital. I did have some choice there.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't do deep research, but I listened to a lot of people and I picked a person who turned out to be fabulous for lots of reasons.
Mm-hmm.
So I learned about that. And the other thing I learned through all of this was that you really have to pay attention. I had to pay attention. Shouldn't be prescriptive. I had to pay attention. Things like that you wouldn't think of necessarily. What types of alternative therapies there are, what types of testing is there, and to repair yourself. So, for example, I had a bone marrow sample taken,
Mm-hmm.
a biopsy. That was really painful. And I was frightened about it, primarily because way back when I was 5 years old, I had to have what they called then a spinal tap, the same thing. And it's one of my clearest memories, earliest in my life. So I was scared. I had to prepare myself for that.
How come they don't put you under anesthesia for a bone marrow test like that?
It's a two-part procedure. So they give you think of a needle going into a bone. So there's the outer part of the bone, like the outer crust of the earth.
Mm-hmm.
For that part, they give you a local anesthetic because apparently that must be the worst. And then it goes into the second layer, which is, I think, a marrow. And then it goes right into the heart of your bone, in your pelvic bone. And they can't give you a sedative for that because that would mess up the test.
Interesting. You've worked on the book for how long?
It's been seriously about a year and a half. I'd say a year and a half.
And how far away are you from the release date of your book?
We'll be releasing it in time for the Royal Palm Literary Awards, which are conducted in the entries by the end of April. So we're going to have it in before then, probably in May.
Do you have a working title for the book?
Not really. We have a less than working title, which is Cancer, Mike and Jim's Special Adventure.
Okay, that sounds like a good title.
That's been reviewed by no one of authority or knowledge.
And you intend to place the book on sale through Amazon
Yes.
as a self-published book?
That's the plan right now. Although that's interesting. Here in the village, there are a lot of people who get involved in not just writing, but also publishing. And we've had a few people who have floated with us the idea that maybe we might go with a publisher, but our plan is to basically self-publish at this point.
And neither one of you have published a book before?
Well, Jim has.
Okay.
Jim has done a number of textbooks, but not any creative nonfiction.
Okay, so if you've listened to this podcast before, my listeners know I always suggest to authors, turn the book into an audiobook as quickly as you can, for the simple reason that there are people who, A, don't read, their eyes aren't as good as they used to be, B, who don't want to sit down and concentrate, but they'll be willing to listen to a book as they're doing exercises at the gym, walking in the neighborhood, or even shopping in Target.
We had a little conversation in preparation for this, and I totally get it. I love audiobooks. I used to do a lot of global traveling for work.
Okay.
And listening was the easiest way to make the flight from San Francisco to Tokyo or from San Francisco to London.
Yeah, there are a lot of books that you can get away with doing that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now, if you could give some advice to a 25-year-old Michael, based on your knowledge now, what advice would you give to your 25-year-old self?
To my 25-year-old self, I would probably say, stay the course. I think you have to follow your heart dream, or at least try to understand what it is you like to do, rather than listening to others tell you or prescribe for you what you should do in your future. Life really is a wonderful series of opportunities. It's like those waves I talked about with the pain.
Mm-hmm.
When you are that young, that aware, you have your strength, you're physically strong, You feel like you can do almost anything. The hardest thing to do, I think, is to go inside yourself, find out what your strengths are, and then go after what you love.
Is there going to be a website for the book, or how can people contact you if they have questions?
There is going to be a website for the book. It's not there yet. If anyone wants to contact me now, I'm at mikebookWriter@gmail.com. I'd be glad to answer any questions or keep you up to date.
Great. Thanks for joining us today, Michael.
That was my pleasure. Thank you, Mike.
Remember, our next episode will be released next Friday at 9 a.m. Should you want to become a major supporter of the show or have questions, please contact us at mike@rothvoice.com. This is a shout out for supporters Ed Williams, Dwayne Romich, Paul Sorgen, Kathy Loving, and Dr. Craig Curtis at K2 in the Villages. We will be hearing more from Dr. Curtis with short Alzheimer's tips each week. If you know someone who should be on the show, contact us at mike@rothvoice.com. The way our show grows is with your help. Text your friends about this show if you enjoyed listening, or just tell your friends about the show. We thank everyone for listening to the show. The content of the show is copyrighted by Roth Voice 2025. All rights reserved.